Okay, everybody, welcome back to day 4 of the DSH Diversion Academy. Today we are going to be focusing on housing. I just have a couple quick reminders for everybody in our audience as we get going here. If you can please try to remember to keep yourself on mute while we are going through the presentation to help limit background noise. We'd really appreciate it. I will be scanning the attendee or the participant list throughout just to try to catch where any noise is coming from, but it helps if you guys can try to track your own mute status. That would be wonderful. If you are having any technical issues, please feel free to send a message into the chat box and we can help with that. Just a reminder that you can also use the chat box to send in questions throughout the presentation. We will be taking questions at different stages, but if you think of something and you don't want to forget it and you want to send it in, that's one way to do it. You can also use the raise hand function if you have a question to ask, and we can call on you and unmute you at that time. And I think with that, I'm going to turn things over to our lead presenters today, Mr. Charles Francis and Mr. Thomas Coyne.
All right, hello everybody. We're so happy to be with you today. My name is Charlie Francis. I am a project manager with the Council State Government's Justice Center. I oversee our housing portfolio, which is national in scope, but we are working very closely in California. We have been working in particular over the past couple of years, really, with the Council of Criminal Justice and Behavioral Health, focusing on taking a statewide look at what state and local leaders can really do to increase housing opportunities for people who are leaving the justice system. So we're so happy to be here today as to expand on that work and draw on it and really look at this really important population and this issue around IST diversion. So we'll be drawing on that work, but we've also brought in a number of local housing experts that are really going to be into more depth in sharing what they have learned at both the state and local level. So we're hoping to give you a really good session here. Thomas, you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, my name is Thomas Coyne, Senior Policy Analyst here at the Justice Center, where I work with Charlie in our housing portfolio. I come to this work from the community perspective of having been a case manager in behavioral health, as well as in foster care, both here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, as well as rural Michigan. So nice random experiences. Otherwise work with Charlie on helping counties and states and very occasionally the federal government on this cross-cutting issue that we're all here to address today. So thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. On the next slide, we just have our agenda for the day. After I go through this, I'll hand it back to Ashley for just some brief context around the IST population and housing supportive services. And then my colleague Mark Trott is going to give us some basics on housing fundamentals and kind of the key things, policies, partners, and approaches that you might need to know to the foundation for our day today. And then we'll zoom in a little bit, talk more specifically about the role of assessing housing needs and connecting people to housing, and kind of the glue that can take people from the point of diversion to bringing them successfully back home to the community. Then we'll have our first breakout session where you'll have some time to really go in more depth into who your local housing partners might be and brainstorm some of the resources they might be able to bring to the table. Then we'll have a little break and report back. I'll take us through some basics on strategies for funding housing with a real particular focus on how you might be able to deploy the DSH funding and combine it with some of the new federal and state resources that are out there. And then the agenda continues on the next slide. Then I'll be really excited to introduce you to a great panel for you with representatives from LA, from San Diego, and from the right here, Tulare County, Kings Tulare Homeless Alliance, sharing about 3 very different communities and how they have approached implementing housing solutions for this population, kind of some of the challenges they've encountered, the things they've learned, et cetera. Then we'll have another break. We'll have our second breakout session, kind of putting it all together towards developing a housing plan, and then we'll wrap up for the day. Yeah, so I'm going to hand it back to Ashley. I think I want to give a little more context on the IST population before we pass it over to Mark.
Excellent, thank you. Should probably turn my camera on. Hi, everybody. So actually, both Sean and I are going to talk to you a little bit about the information that you see here up on this slide and really the reasons we are here today and why we elected to devote an entire day of our academy to the topic of housing. So I'm going to hand it over to Sean to kind of start us off, and then I will bring up the rear at the end.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Welcome again, and I'm just so glad to be able to continue this, I think these really important conversations. And, you know, as Ashley was saying, you know, housing is, you know, over and over again identified as a critical issue in working with this population. And so we really just wanted to kind of, you know, devote an entire day to sort of addressing and discussing this, as well as kind of start off this day, you know, really providing a context. And so the slide you see, you know, this great map, you know, the state of California, and what those different, you know, it's divided by county. You know, one of the things that you see, you know, if you can see the legend up there, light blue identifies homelessness at time of arrest is, you know, falling at 0 to 25%. The dark blue, that 26 to 50%. That kind of light orange being the 51 to 75%, and the dark orange being the 76 to 100%, you know, rate of homelessness at the time of arrest. You know, and really, I think a couple of striking things come out of this graphic, and that is that 50% or more, you know, of our counties. I'm sorry, you know, all but 12 of our counties have 50% or more homelessness at the time of arrest, and 4 counties actually have 100%. You know, this is really, really, you know, critical information, and it's really consistent with our own research. If you recall, on the first day of our diversion training, Dr. Warburton kind of went through some research that Dr. McDermott from UC Davis had done, and this totally matches and is consistent with our own findings. If you recall, when we were looking at statewide admissions in 2016 to 2017, a little over 47% of our ISPs that were admitted to the DSH system were unsheltered. And when we continued to look at that same sort of statewide admissions between 2018 and 2020, that percent went up to 65.5% for our ISP population, and that one included all types of homelessness. So this is like, you know, a really significant barrier, and, you know, these are barriers that our counties have reported to us as well through surveys, which I'm going to hand it back over to Ashley to talk a little bit about some of the surveys that have been done.
Thanks, Sean. And just before I go on, Charlie, do you mind? Thank you. All right. So as Sean was saying, the issue of housing for this population is something that has come up as a barrier for this type of programming. In really multiple surveys that have been done, most recently DSH did a survey of the counties who are already participating with us on this project, and the Council of State Governments has been conducting a statewide survey. And in both of those surveys, housing was identified as one of the top, if not the top, barriers to having a diversion program or being able to divert more individuals in a mental health diversion program. And anecdotally, it's also been a struggle something that we've worked really closely with our current county partners on to help them problem solve and try to think creatively in order to find housing for this particular population, because, it's a highly stigmatized population. It's difficult to place these individuals sometimes into housing, and they have, I think, kind of the three strikes of having a serious mental illness, and then being justice involved, and not just being justice involved, but having a felony charge, which I think brings it kind of another level of stigma into play for these types of programs. So we wanted to make sure that we really dedicated a lot of time to this topic for you all as you are working through your program planning processes in your county, to give you information and hopefully some ideas of pathways that you may be able to take to help you work through this particular barrier that we know, it exists. We know that it's a difficult problem. I mean, it's a difficult problem, right, in our state, even beyond this particular programming. So we know it's not easy, but we're hoping that the information you get today and the information that's going to be shared with our guests will help you think through this particular issue.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley and Sean, for that context. To take us into our housing fundamentals section, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Mark Trotz, who will introduce himself and go into things a little bit deeper and lay the foundation for the rest of our day. So take it away, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Charles. Yeah, my name is Mark Trotz. Nice to be here with everybody. I've worked primarily in housing and housing related to healthcare issues and homelessness and criminal justice issues for basically most of my life, and with a big concentration in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And Charles, I may not follow the slides exactly, but you'll probably see where I'm going with it. So bear with me as I jump around a little bit. But so my goal here, just for this next 15 minutes or so, is to just really try to cut through some of the jargon and some of the terminology that I know can be somewhat confusing and somewhat baffling around housing, just like any other specialty, whether it's criminal justice or mental health. There's a ton of acronyms, and I often find that people in counties and cities have been sort of bombarded by all this terminology, and sometimes, lose the thread exactly of, what some of the options are. And sort of the overall takeaway I hope to through this discussion and maybe some of the subsequent ones this afternoon is sort of drive home that there's, a lot of different options for housing people. There's this kind of housing orthodoxy that you might hear from some people. And I would just encourage that you all on the ground who are trying to make housing placements and get community housing placements for folks coming out of jail, sort of look outside of that. There will be people who say that, this person absolutely needs this type of intervention. You might hear that from a psychiatrist or other health professional or someone else, that, it's not safe to place this person in X environment, or that won't work. And just throughout my experience, I have found that that is often not the case. Those are sort of perceived and, kind of well-worn tracks about what type of, either licensed housing or unlicensed housing somebody needs coming out of jail, coming out of the hospital, coming off the street. But at the same time, and I think many on this, presenting and on this call have experienced that there's often a multitude or several housing options that could work for that person. And most importantly, what does that person want? And what has their experience been? And what has their housing or residential placements that, say, haven't worked in the past. Let's not repeat those. Let's try something else. So I'm going to just try to set the stage this afternoon a little bit about what some of the main sort of categories and trade-offs of different type of housing are. And if we can hit the next slide. So I guess I'm using the term housing, but I really want to just say residential environment, because some people don't consider various. I think when you use the word housing, people often think permanent housing, but let's just sort of blur all the lines for a second and just think about where people can go. Where is a place that is going to be better than continuing to be in jail and better than being discharged to the street? And again, there's not always the optimal place to be, but there's always, in my opinion, or most of the time, a place that's better than the alternative of being homeless or staying institutionalized. So I'm just starting with the top category there. In the housing world, there's two broad categories. There's licensed housing and unlicensed housing. And there are some distinctions between them. I think in general, people assume that a licensed housing setting is going to have, is going to be more supervised, maybe a higher level of care, and so forth. And I think in broad brushstrokes, that's true. But I also want to just challenge people to think about that as well, that I've seen many unlicensed supportive housing sites and other types of sites or environments actually do a better job and provide more supervision, provide more flexibility, provide more care. So, that's one thing. But in general, a licensed setting, it's normally licensed by the state, either the Department of Social Services or the Department of Health Services, depending on what it is. And it carries, a bunch of regulations and rules related to that licensure, whether it's an adult residential facility licensed from the State Department of Social Services, or whether it's a residential treatment setting licensed by the Department of Health Services. So that is one broad category, and I would say in general, many of those environments, licensed environments, can be shorter term, can be more treatment oriented, tend to be more treatment oriented, tend to come with a lot of rules about staffing and histories, and can in some cases be a little bit more restrictive. I know I'm sort of sounding like anti-licensed housing. I'm not. I'm just trying to draw the distinction. It can certainly, it plays a role in the continuum of housing. On the other side is the whole world of unlicensed housing, which is just housing. And that would be what's often known as PSH, or permanent supportive housing, which people equate with an apartment building with on-site services. It can be, scattered site housing. It can be a regular apartment building with roving services. There's a whole, the whole range of housing that is unlicensed is basically housing out there that people who have criminal justice histories, people who don't have criminal justice histories, that people access. So, when you're thinking about what someone needs, you'll be confronted with, are we looking at a licensed housing environment, or are we looking at an unlicensed housing environment? I would say the other sort of key, and within all this, there's a ton of acronyms that people refer to. I'm going to try to stay away from those and just talk about the main categories. I'd say the other big, one of the other big, categories is whether this housing is, interim housing in nature. On the slide, it says transitional housing. I'm using sort of a broader category, interim housing or permanent. And that's something else that, people have a lot of feelings about, whether their first move out of jail or off the streets needs to be in to a permanent housing environment, or this person needs some sort of interim or transitional setting. I think both play a really important role in many communities and in many situations. It's hard to find that permanent housing slot right off the bat, and therefore, you don't want someone languishing in a restrictive environment that they don't need to be in. So having what I'm going to call interim housing options is really important for achieving your goals and making that placement happen. I would say in most successful systems, all of those interim housing options, the people working with clients in those environments are having an eye towards what is the next, where is that person moving? Where is the next longer term housing option? It's not always, and I just want to stress, it's not always transitional or interim housing to permanent housing. There's, I think there's a slide coming down the road, which we can talk about in a second, that talks about housing first and so forth. And so there's certainly a whole cadre of housing and people who think that, the most successful options are often trying to move directly into permanent housing. The other sort of main one of the other main distinctions in housing is whether we're talking about sort of single site housing or scattered site housing. And, just to make sure we're all on the same page about that term, by scattered site housing, it's basically meaning units out in the community. It can be an apartment in a larger market rate building. Oops, my screen just went dark. There we go, back. It can be a single family home in a residential neighborhood. It can be one side of a duplex. It can be, all sorts of things, and that's known as scattered site. And scattered site can have services. So there's often the assumption that someone can only get the level of services they need in a larger building. And for one thing, given the counties that are on, at this meeting, we're not talking about, by and large urban areas. And it's not going to be in your context, in your housing context, to have, a 120 unit supportive housing site. So, I always like to point out that you can have what is permanent supportive housing, meaning the person is living in an apartment with a lease, and with good access to services that come to the house, roving support services, and linkage to others. So, I think this term PSH is often, just reserved for the larger sites. I'd like to expand it to include scattered sites. So it's not, you're in scattered site, that means you have low service needs and you don't get any services. So that's, something we can come back to and talk about. I see, on the slide here, recovery housing. I would put that probably in the larger category of interim housing, that there is at times a need for an environment that is substance free, and clients will, some clients will opt for that, and in some cases that's, a good option. It's a tricky area because in permanent housing and in other environments, it's that's hard to regulate. It's often not, sort of legal to regulate. So, I just find this whole area of recovery housing, sometimes tricky to navigate, but nonetheless, a valid category. Let's see. The other thing I want to hit upon, and I don't know if it's on one of the next slides or not, is sort of this whole category of rent subsidies. There's I think people have heard probably of Section 8. People have heard of different terms for rent subsidies, the flexible housing subsidy program in Los Angeles, which we're going to talk further. I just want to make sure everyone understands what a rent subsidy is and why it's so important. So, basically, people who are coming out of jail, people who are on the street, people who are extremely low income, are going to be earning somewhere between 0 and maybe $1,000 on SSI, or a little less shy. In most environments, not in all, and in maybe some of the counties that are participating, that would be 100% of someone's income. So the rent subsidy concept is simply that for most people who are coming out of homelessness, there needs to be some way to augment someone's rent so they can afford market rate housing or afford housing in the marketplace. So if you're not accessing a place that is subsidized on its own and can accommodate someone on an extremely low income, then there needs to be some rent subsidy. And many communities in California are experimenting with different ways to provide that. In my work prior in Los Angeles, I would often say that if you have a rent subsidy and good support service dollars, or good support service funding and good support service providers, you can almost house anybody. It may not be in the traditional way that someone is thinking they're going to be housed, or in the exact environment that is the most obvious. But if you can help pay someone's rent and you have them hooked up to lock solid subsidies, you can normally make something happen. Then I wanted to just hit, I just mentioned prior, but I just want to bring back up sort of the importance of support services. One thing I have found in my work in different communities is, oftentimes the jurisdiction will say, or the provider will say, yes, we have access to support services, or this housing has support services attached. And that's really easy to say, but when you look more closely at that, it often is in name only. Either the caseloads are so high, or the type of service that you're connected to is sort of an office-based service. Okay, this housing is, connected to this mental health service at this clinic. Or some other type of support service which is actually not intensive enough to sort of, ensure that someone has stay stable in their housing environment. So just throughout all of this, without all of the housing, typologies and so forth that we're talking about, the importance of knowing that the support services are really there, that you have someone linked to that person who's rock solid, who's there, who's that person's advocate, who's not going to be looking for, excuses not to help, or reasons to, get someone kicked out of their housing and so forth. So, that sort of cuts through all of this. Is the, you have the rent. If you have the rent subsidy, they're able to, afford their rent, which is obviously like job number one. But job number two is a true linkage to high quality support services. In terms of, so those are some of the key distinctions. In terms of, as you dig more into your strategy for housing however number of people that you intend to try to house through this program, and thinking about how to use the DSH money, I would be thinking of like a multi-pronged strategy. The communities that I've seen do better at this are not hanging their hat on, any one thing. They're not, it's not all going to come from the housing authority. It's not all going to be scattered site. It's not all going to be from affordable housing producers. It's really more of a, this and that and the other and so forth. And so it's about figuring out what housing resources are, or housing environments are a potential for your community, and figuring out how to access those environments. And that's why I think this DSH money that you guys are all receiving is so important, because it's flexible. So it doesn't have to be used all for the same thing. So if you're trying to, say, access a local board and care, for instance, that you think could have good services for someone needing this type of housing, but that board and care is struggling. They don't have enough money for on-site health care or health services or other services. This money can provide that additional incentive. Or there's an affordable housing site in the community that already has, say, project-based Section 8, so the unit itself is affordable, but the sponsor is hesitant to take IST clients because of, fear of not having enough services or not having the correct services to help that person. This money can be used to bridge that gap. So the advantage of this kind of flexible money is sort of use it to wedge yourself into, a whole myriad of housing environments. And, that obviously takes a lot of persuasion and work on the ground to induce and draw people in to want to do this. But having that flexible funding can be really important. I think there's a slide, Charles, on housing partners. Do you want to just flip to that? Well, why don't we just talk about housing first for a second, since that's popping up here. I think people here we go. Housing partners and resources. Okay. And I probably have just about 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone, I haven't been keeping track of the time. I don't know if anyone can chime in and tell me how much time I have left. I think you're muted.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. All right, so I'm gonna just try to get through this. So in terms of housing partners, it is, somehow that whole thing had my screen go to. Sorry, guys. I've had some kind of crazy, there it is, some kind of crazy screensaver pop on. This is where I think you have to really, expand your creativity. These are some of the obvious places to turn to: your continuum of care, your public housing authority who administers Section 8, private landlords. I shouldn't say the obvious, these are a lot of them, but you want to try to hit all of these. There's privately owned there's private landlords in your community who will work with this population, given the assurances that you can continue to subsidize the rent and provide. There's affordable housing providers and supportive housing providers who may not be as familiar and comfortable with the ISG population, but engaging them and providing the assurances that there's going to be services and services and subsidies available. And then I think later on in the presentation, folks are going to talk about sort of how people have accessed their homeless services network, their continuum of care, to try to make sure that this population is not overlooked, essentially. And then, just sort of bouncing back to the housing first principle, kind of back to where I started on this, is that, the goal is really to get people into housing. And housing first is essentially a philosophy that says, that's the foundation. That's what we need to do. People need to get into housing and not have a lot of preconditions and a lot of issues that screen them out of housing. And I think, there's people who have been practicing housing first for quite some time. It's been proven to work. There are some situations where a more intensive and perhaps slightly more restrictive housing environment work better for some people. So it's not a across the board, solution, but the concept of the system that we're trying to make sure that we're not putting up a lot of unreasonable requests and restrictions before someone can get into housing is sort of the foundation of housing first, and that with good services and good engagement and intensive case management, that a lot of the issues that may have happened in the past or issues that people fear will happen in reality tend not to. Not that there are not issues and not that people, you know, there's not instances in where people blow out of housing, but across many different communities in California and the country, people have had a lot of success with getting people directly into housing. In many cases, it's permanent housing and wrapping services around. And, you know, just one more note on the term permanent housing. You know, housing, yeah, I should have pointed out when we were talking about interim versus permanent. The main distinction there is that there is not a artificial time limit on the permanent housing. Interim housing, you normally don't sign a lease. It's some sort of program agreement, and normally there's some parameters in which the length of time in which someone can stay. In permanent housing, you generally do have a lease with the tenant, and someone can stay as long as they want. That's not akin to saying that people don't move, people don't, you know, people don't get tired of living in a certain permanent supportive housing environment and want something else. So it's not, you know, it's not that someone is trapped there forever and that's the highest aspiration that we have for that person. But it doesn't come with a sort of, you know, time ticking of, you know, 6 months or 9 months or 2 years or something like that. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. So I think now we're going to move on to dive a little deeper into the role of assessing housing needs and connecting people with housing, and how those are both really critically important to successful community-based diversion placement. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Thomas to go into that. So take it away, Thomas.
Charlie, and thanks, Mark, for setting everything up with just how very important it is to ultimately get folks into permanent housing. On the next slide, you know, we know that there's this glue really that holds it all together, and that both the assessment piece and the connections piece. We know really that it's about universal assessments, making sure that everyone is assessed. We also know that with limited staff time and wanting also to avoid assessment fatigue, we know that it's really about simple assessments that fit within what you've already got going on to navigate folks back towards community success. You know, I'm probably not alone in having conducted inReach for people who've been incarcerated, only for it to fall apart when folks are discharged, say at 1 a.m. when you're not on call. You know, that happens, but also it's the ways that we can build our processes then to avoid those kind of things. So on the next slide, now this is about you know, really getting the key pieces of assessment with questions on homelessness and housing instability, preference and location. You know, you don't want to send someone back to a place where they've frequently relapsed or places that they might otherwise not thrive in. Also using questions to help determine the level of supportive services, like Mark was talking about, with sometimes very intensive services, especially for this population. And also services that are really relevant to who a person is and really meets them where they are as their own person. While also making sure that we're connecting people back to things like Medi-Cal, SSI, CalFresh, all those things that we all know, but also just making sure that we're asking those questions so we know we have those check boxes for ourselves. And also considerations for using the services and flexible funding, you know, we can find to get people back to where they want to be, like supported employment and services such as that. On the next slide, you know, it's never quite as easy as a flow chart, but really it is about adapting risk and needs and responsivity. You know, we're really talking about taking someone through their criminogenic risk and what kind of supervision supports there can be there. You know, seeing what housing and supportive services needs can be addressed, and what strengths to build on. And being really responsive to preference and choice and pairing that with services in the community. And choice is just so central to this. As Mark got to, like, having a continuum of options available for people who are experiencing homelessness, so they can be in a place that is both important to them and then also that they'll thrive in. So on to the next slide. Now, this is also about the key service models, and typically that are built around PSH, and often for the folks that we're talking about here who have often the highest needs. And with urban supportive housing, there are two evidence-based models in the field that includes intensive case management, as well as assertive community teams. And ACT also has a related forensic assertive community treatment team. And both of these are evidence-based and really the way to help bring to bear these multi-system partners to support people in the community. And really that lead then to the big positive outcomes that we want to see for IST. Such as just getting folks stable, really getting things into place and being assertive and making sure that people have a stable place they can be successful in. And I think, as Mark touched on, we really do need to then hold our systems accountable and make sure that our agencies are not just always necessarily trying to think of the best word for this, but otherwise like discharging folks from an agency when they burn out at an agency, so they're not left in a lurch, so to speak. That's something that I saw all too often that happened with my own clients. And because really then we know that that's when they cycle. And, we got to this earlier again with Mark and talking about mobile and on-site services. And, I, as a case manager, saw on-site services be so very helpful, as well as working in rural areas where, I cover 3 counties and had a lower caseload, thankfully. But there are ways then to scale that across communities. And we've seen places across the country be successful in this. I think, and especially in homelessness as well, with pairing these regional approaches then to help both have funding available across the region, because that's one way to make things scalable, is to partner together with others, as well as not necessarily then only have programs focused on just one population. So, for instance, there could be an existing ACT team, and maybe it's helping support that ACT team with funding then to dedicate a caseload spot on that team to someone who's coming out of IST, and really using that funding in a thoughtful way to build on what's already existing in the community, and really building out from there. And now on the next slide, I think we will move into our breakout sessions. I think we'll have up until about 2:10 for our breakout sessions, and then we'll take a break after that and come back at 2:20 and report out.
Okay, so yes, you guys can bear with us for 1 second. Okay, everybody, welcome back from break. I think we will now move into our first report out following that breakout session. And I just want to apologize for any technical difficulties that may have been going on in the various rooms. WebEx breakout sessions does not want to work today, at least not very well, and we had an entire county that couldn't get into their breakout room. So I do apologize to everybody else as well. We are trying to problem solve these technical issues as they are coming up. So we just ask that you bear with us, and we will do our best to resolve things as they happen. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to Thomas to lead, I think, Thomas, you want to lead everybody through the report back from the breakout session?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so I think what might work, what Katie has told me probably works best, is I'll call in each county, and if the facilitator for that county could pull someone from the group to report out for 2 minutes on what seemed most compelling from your breakout session. So we'll start with Madera County, facilitator there.
Hey, Thomas, can you hear me all right? Can we unmute, this is Hallie reporting in from Madera. Can we unmute Julie Morgan to share our conversation? We had a really nice talk about some of the resources that are currently online in Madera County for temporary housing, and then we talked a little bit about some of the barriers for more permanent housing for the diversion participants. But I'll let Julie fill in the details.
Thank you. So we talked some about the benefits of being able to leverage these funds to incentivize some of our housing partners to participate. Some of the barriers being the narrow definitions of HUD and the complications that will cause, especially the IST population. When we're working with our continuum of care, they don't identify the inmates as being homeless because they're currently housed when they're incarcerated. And so that, for our area, they identify them as no longer being homeless, and so they don't meet that 30 days of homelessness unless they're out of jail for 30 days. So that's one of the barriers that we foresee. But we do have a local resource. We work closely with our local rescue mission, and so we have some funds that we have leveraged to have a separate housing unit they have there on their campus that we've used for some of our clients with our behavioral health court. And so we're anticipating being able to leverage that as well with this population. So we're hoping that they will be on board with utilizing those resources as well with them.
Julie, both for showing how you'll be able to utilize resources and for also illustrating the all too common barrier that I think many of us have come into, which is the HUD definition, and both in its like application for prioritizing people as well as when sometimes continuums of care or public housing authorities are excluding people who are incarcerated, even though that really doesn't get to the spirit of the HUD definition. But I think we absolutely know that that happens in practice, which is its own giant challenge. Now we turn it over to Nevada.
Hi, Thomas. This is Sheila, the facilitator for Nevada County, and I'm going to turn it over to Micah Pierce, if we could unmute him to give the report out for Nevada.
Yeah, so our group was a little bit, we were challenged that we didn't have every single person that would have been able to speak to the issue, but in our county, I think it's fair to say that our housing need for housing this population exceeds our capacity, and in the courts I work in, there's usually a shortage of housing and usually having to rotate clients between houses or rotate them out of housing for a short period for it to become available. Additionally, we touched briefly on the kind of challenges that these particular individuals represent in terms of housing placement. But the people we had in our group didn't have particularly good information about the partners who our behavioral health services partner with for housing individuals.
The lack of finance, unfortunately, is such a problem across all of the United States. Although we will be getting the funding, as you probably see on the screen. Now that'll be our next topic of some ways, especially now with dramatic increase in federal rental assistance and funding for actually building housing. Perhaps there are some ways to leverage some of the DSH funding with some of the new ARP funding that's coming down. But hopefully. Now, actually, I'll turn it over to myself for San Joaquin, and I think I'll turn it over to Casey Rain.
Hi, this is Casey. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi. So we had also a little bit of technical challenges, and as part of it, we did agree to continue this conversation. Essentially, what we were talking about is kind of a multi-pronged strategy that we want to start pursuing in San Joaquin County. One is working a little bit more closely with our continuum of care. They're in the process of setting up the criteria for our coordinated entry system and access to housing for those who are homeless, and just making sure that we can circle and touch bases with them about the nature and scope of this project so that we have countywide buy-in from our continuum of care and our homeless services stakeholders and partners for our efforts, and hopefully then that we can align some of the strategic priorities for coordinated entry with our strategic priorities around this project and this population. And then the second thing that we talked about was really how do we set up a multi-phase and multi-structure kind of program whereby maybe we don't have enough licensed beds as we want, but maybe we don't think about licensed beds as permanent housing anyway, and that we really want to create is a system whereby people move through or flow or step into the right level of housing depending on their care and treatment needs. So that was the other thing that we were talking about, is how do we, maybe instead of having a grand scope and vision of one big provider, how do we kind of stage it into different levels that kind of better align to the flow chart that was posted earlier in this presentation, because we don't think we're going to get one big provider or partner. So I hope that feels like a kind of a summary of where we got to, and then of course more conversations.
Great to see the continued conversations that will come out, and also that it's so important to have really what you're talking about the full continuum of housing options for people to meet them where they're at and meet their health and so I was really happy to have been able to hear that conversation. And I'll turn it over to Stanislav. Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. So we had Chandra Campbell. She was our individual one-on-one TA participant with Mark and Lahila, but I'll turn it over to Chandra to summarize if she doesn't mind.
Katie, I'm not seeing Chandra.
Oh, no. I don't see her either. I don't know what happened to her. Oh, well, why don't we go to another team, Thomas, and maybe she'll come back.
We'll wait for Chandra. And Chandra, if you are here maybe under a call-in user, please just message us and we'll get to you. I'll turn it over to Talair.
Thanks, Thomas. We're actually going to have Ryan Caceres report out on our discussion.
Deirdre, I kind of heard you, but I think someone might be typing if folks can just make sure that they're muted.
Oh, sure. We're going to have Ryan Caceres report out from our session.
Okay, so we talked about the barriers to housing, and we discussed things that I think are similar among a lot of counties. There are stigmas among placements regarding individuals with serious mental disorders. And then we talked about how the partnerships are. So in Tulare County, we have a good network of housing providers, but the issue that we run into again is that the beds, once they're taken, they don't rotate very frequently. The bed usually remains filled for a long period of time, kind of constraining our placement options. But one of the substantive items that we did cover is that, you know, the way that it works right now among finding housing for individuals with serious mental illness is that the case manager or the caseworker, they're the ones who liaise with these room and board providers. And kind of what the problem is with that is that we have many caseworkers at any given time reaching out to many room and board providers. And the direction that we kind of initially took with that is that maybe we could have some kind of training that would be available to case managers to give them more skills in the area of competence when it comes to dealing with room and board providers, knowing what their goals are and understanding the things that would maybe make them more likely to accept our referrals. And then in having that conversation, we also went to an example that Deidre had provided us about her experience, and what they had done was that they had actually assigned a housing specialist, and that person's role was only to get the case managers, they would communicate to the housing specialist, and that housing specialist would be the single source who is trained and competent in dealing with room and board providers, and it would kind of be a single source of information. Because, you know, if a room and board provider is dealing with a bunch of case managers, then they may be confused about who to reach out to if they have a payment issue, or if they want to talk about their contract, or if they want to do any kinds of administrative related things. It would just be helpful to kind of be able to train up the caseworkers, or to maybe have a centralized position where all that person does is function as the liaison for room and board providers.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And yeah, that example that Deirdre gives, that's such a powerful and I think maybe a best practice set, but definitely an emerging practice of having folks who can speak the same language as those providers, and maybe even hiring from among those providers to then recruit among them and to really be that liaison. It's a really great and stand-up way of getting folks on board. And finally, I'll turn it over to Tuolumne.
Thanks, Thomas. We had a really good discussion, and I'm wondering if Tammy is available to do our report back.
Oh no, Tracy.
Thank you,
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I'm going to ask the Tuolumne team to backfill anything that I may miss. I'm Brock's backup, but I was listening. So overall, my takeaway from our session was that Tuolumne County team agrees that our biggest challenge, in fact, will be housing. Our treatment programs are in place. We have great buy-in and appreciation for wraparound services and the unique services that the team brings to the table. Tuolumne County's housing pricing is extremely high compared maybe to our neighboring counties. The inventory moves very quickly. Historically, we have experienced stigma related to housing our population, even in so much that when we have attempted to build out our own homes, we typically have received back that individual residents would love to see people have supportive to permanent housing, but they don't want it in their neighborhood. So the challenge for us absolutely is housing hands down. We have began to discuss different models, partnering with entities that have a focus and mission to create housing for our population. And the likes of Resiliency Village is one entity that was mentioned that we may be able to partner with and braid in our services with their housing piece to maybe have an initial plan. Brock also mentioned one of the key pieces is having a staff or a house manager support on site, being able to keep order in the home, and the various elements that we would like to see in housing be reiterated outside of business hours and when our service providers aren't necessarily available. Anybody else want to add anything to that?
If you're part of the Tuolumne team and would like to add anything, please just use the raise hand icon and I can unmute you. I don't see any raised hands, so I think we're good to move on. Thomas.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, that's such a salient point of having that 24/7 coverage in some form or another. They can really put people at ease and really then bridge that gap to make sure that if things flare up overnight, that things can then be managed and worked towards come morning. And thanks everyone for sharing. And I think now we'll turn it back over to Charlie to talk about housing funding opportunities that are coming up both at the federal and state level. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Hi, everybody. Glad to be back with you here. So I'm just going to give you a little flavor of the, some of the key funding resources that are out there and how they might combine with the opportunities that you have with the DSH funding. So just to give you a little taste of it, and then we'll have plenty of time for our panel and our next breakout discussion. So if you go to the next slide, please. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the American Rescue Plan and how it really brings substantial resources for housing. And the cool thing is there are many different funding streams. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them today that are most important for you to know about. And the best thing about these is that they're very flexible. They are really available to meet both short-term needs to help connect people with housing through services, help them access housing through rental assistance, but also to meet long-term inventory development, because we all know there's just not enough housing in the first place. So the funding stream I want to bring your attention to the most is Home ARP. It is, the Home Investments Partnership Program is a funding stream that comes out from HUD every year, and this is a special allocation that's more flexible and allows you to do more things. And you're able to use it for rental assistance, services, and developing new things. And I just want to draw your attention that these home allocations, along with a lot of these ARP funds, there are chunks of money going to different levels of government, different stakeholders. There's a big chunk going to the state overall, but then there's also smaller chunks going to counties and cities, including several in this group. A couple of examples here: $10 million to Stockton and San Joaquin County, that's combined. $3.5 million to Modesto and $1.8 million to Visalia. So, there's some money out there. And I think the two things you really need to know about this funding source is that these, both state and especially the local and county governments, they're going to have a deadline soon to submit a plan to HUD detailing what their needs and gaps are in the community and how they plan to use the funding. This is a really great time to get to know your local community development department, your local elected officials, and really be able to keep an eye out for the public comment period and really advocate that using the funding to provide housing for this population is really an efficient use that helps not just criminal justice folks meet their mission, but also housing folks who are some of our most vulnerable residents. And you just want to be getting to know kind of who your local developers are, like we were talking about earlier, getting to know your local chair, your local housing authority, because in the longer term, we're going to talk more about more shorter term funding opportunities today, but in the longer term, you'll want to really be at the table to access these funds to ultimately increase the supply of housing. Next slide, please. More briefly, I also want to draw your attention to the Treasury, state, and local fiscal recovery funds. This is a much bigger pot of money that can be used for housing. It's also used for many, many other things around public health and economic development and so forth. There's also a large state allocation and direct allocations to actually more cities and counties even than under home ARP. And generally, governments have made their initial plans for using these funds, but they have to be spent over a period of approximately 3 years, and there's a lot of flexibility remaining. So again, it's just really important to get to know the people locally who control these purse strings, because there's really some room to advocate to help grade these resources with the other resources that you have under DSH to really create a package of housing and services for the population. And some counties are already doing this. A couple I pulled out here, I believe it's from San Joaquin County. They're using some of this funding for landlord incentives, which is a strategy that we really want to recommend. You know, private landlords control most of the housing inventory at a given community. And by creating financial incentives to lease to the population, keep them housed, as well as things like risk mitigation funds that people can draw on in case of damages or if somebody skips out on rent, you can really open up more housing inventory, especially for those folks that may have burned bridges in the past. I know that's a concern among this group. And then one other resource, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with and we're going to hear more about during the panel, is HUD's emergency housing vouchers. And so these are a resource. They're housing choice vouchers, but again, it's a special allocation that's allocated to housing authorities, but they come through the continuum of care coordinated entry system. And HUD has encouraged communities and COCs to prioritize people who have been involved with the justice system for these vouchers as some of the most vulnerable, some of those who are most vulnerable in terms of people who have experienced homeless or at risk of homelessness. And so, again, you really want to get to know your local COC because odds are they are already taking some referrals for these vouchers. And there's still a lot of latitude in adjusting how those are allocated. And you're going to hear some more in our panel later about how one community is starting to successfully do that. Next slide. Oh, I think we skipped. Yep. Real briefly, a lot of new state funds for housing in California too, which is wonderful. The one that I want to draw your attention to most is Project Home Key. This was new a year or two ago, but it's been substantially expanded with a combination of state and ARP funds. And it is a way to get new housing online basically faster than you would normally be able to. Rapid acquisition and conversion of properties typically hold hotels and motels. And there's a good amount of money out there. Applications are now open, so it's really time to strike while the iron's hot. And the funding is allocated geographically through certain set-asides, and there's bonus funding for getting in there early, which I believe is also before that 1/31 deadline. It's a great opportunity, perhaps if counties want to join force regionally on an application, because local governments are the lead applicants. It's a great way to maybe join forces with a local developer and maybe either serve this population or sort of a combined population. And it's a way to kind of not just connect people with housing, but again, grow that inventory. And there's some other state funding out there that can help really sustain these new developments with rental assistance and operating costs. Next slide. Now, the pièce de résistance, the DSH funding that you all have access to as part of your grant. This is a wonderful way to strategically support housing. Again, the best way to use it is to combine it with other resources, but there are a couple of questions that you want to be asking yourself, and this is going to be something that we think about more during our second breakout session. If you have this pot of money, $142,000 per person per year. It's a good amount of money, but it's also time limited. I want to be thinking about how can we be combining it with some of these other resources to meet housing and support service needs, particularly in the near term. How can we join forces in a regional approach? And how can we sort of bridge these shorter term solutions into longer-term solutions that really more permanently increase the availability of housing for this population. On the next slide is a quick example of what that thinking might look like. You may want to use this funding for a short-term rental assistance program. You have housing agency partners in the community that can administer programs like that, particularly housing authorities. They already have an infrastructure to administer rental assistance funds, so they could be a really good partner there. Combining with existing resources for service funding and coordination, particularly Medi-Cal and eventually the transition to Cal-AIM. Combined with your COC funding to meet some other costs, particularly like security deposits, utility arrearages. And then you could also use this money to couple this rental assistance with what I was talking about before, landlord financial incentives. So really you are opening up more inventory and you're making it more affordable and sort of creating funding to meet some of the other related costs. So I would encourage you to really start thinking this way about this funding, and I'm really looking forward to these breakout sessions where we'll dig into that more. And I think I ended this section 3 minutes early. So I think we're going to move now to the next slide, and I'm very, very excited to introduce our panel. We are going to have 3 housing experts talking to us today about different strategies that they have undertaken to increase the pool of housing resources available for people with complex needs who have been involved with the justice system. We're going to hear from Mark Trotz again, talking about his story of getting the flexible subsidy pool started in Los Angeles. We're going to hear from Lahela Maddox from San Diego Regional Task Force on the Homeless. And also right here from our diversion group, we're going to hear from Leticia Hinojosa from the Kings Tulare Homeless Alliance. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Mark to get our panel started.
All right. Hello, everybody, again. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief because you already heard from me, and love to hear from the other panelists, and so that you all can learn from their experience as well. So, yeah, you know, I moved down from San Francisco to Los Angeles in 2012 to try to work on homelessness there, and we tried to bring some of the things we were working on in San Francisco and try to, you know, really look at it in a way that could scale for the enormity of the problem in LA. And I know that doesn't necessarily translate to some of the communities we're talking about here, but I think some of the lessons we learned, not so much how we did it or the exact details, but sort of the lessons learned and the kind of fundamental thing we were trying to solve for, I think is pretty applicable no matter where you are in California. So, you know, in trying to house, you know, thousands and thousands of people every year, we really came to the conclusion that the, you know, reliance on sort of the affordable housing sector or capital development, building new projects, was not really going to be, you know, was, and I think still is not really going to be the primary answer to housing chronically homeless people, people coming out of jail, people coming out of health institutions and so forth, just because of the expense and the time it takes. It's not a knock on the affordable housing industry, it's just looking at the real math and looking at the fact that these units are costing, you know, between $500,000 and $700,000 a unit to build and take, you know, 3 to 5 years to do each apartment building. So we, you know, took a deviation from that strategy and started to look at this rent subsidy issue. And we also, you know, this was a different time period, and there are potentially some more Section 8 vouchers available, which was just spoken of, the EHV vouchers. But also recognizing that there's not enough flexible rent subsidy resources out there, especially sort of stigmatized and marginalized populations. Let's see, someone else. needs to get muted there, or at least I'm hearing another voice, that those rent subsidies are not available. So that was really the genesis of trying to do this flexible housing subsidy pool. It was to bring a new rent subsidy resource. And again, it could be something that is that the DSH funds are used to do. And the real advantage of using a local or a targeted funding source versus sort of the more mainstream funding sources is sort of the flexibility, the relief from some of the rules that that some of these other subsidies provide. So in short, the FHSP, the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool, was a vehicle in which we could essentially rent any type of unit anywhere in the county and have our own system for selecting who's eligible for it, our own standard of what type of unit this subsidy applies to and how long the subsidy lasts and so forth. The strategy, and I heard this in either one of the workout groups or in the report back, you know, the other strategy we employed is to try to rationalize the system of finding the units so that we didn't have multiple agencies competing for the same finite pool of private units. So in Los Angeles, that was working with the organization Brilliant Corners, which I know is working in Los Angeles and in other places. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that Brilliant Corners would be your agency in your community, but we sort of developed this concept of a housing intermediary and kind of consolidating that work under one organization so that we could really sort of invest in that organization and have a more simplified message to the landlord community. So in your communities, you may have multiple people out there, behavioral health agencies, you know, justice connected agencies, kind of scrambling around, trying to find motels, single units, and so forth. And this would be, you know, a way to think about this is to sort of consolidate that under a more central system. That doesn't mean you still can't have all sorts of support service agencies chiming in. So for instance, in Los Angeles, while we had one housing intermediary, we had hundreds of support service agencies, and still do, working with that. So anyone working with a client, anyone working with a justice-involved client, anyone working with someone being discharged from a healthcare facility, we wanted to keep that case management involved, but we wanted to have sort of one agency that they could go to get good, skilled housing search. And the other important part of the housing intermediary, as we designed it in Los Angeles, was that they pay the rent subsidy. So there's a whole technical kind of component to a local rent subsidy that needs to be attended to and done well, so that the landlords, don't get burned in any kind of way, and that's paying the monthly rent. If there's some sort of issue that comes up with the client in the unit and the case management and he's not available, that this entity can swoop in and smooth things out. And then I think has been mentioned previously also, just employing a very entrepreneurial approach to identifying these units and negotiating these units, using all sorts of incentives, making sure that you're paying market, making sure you're providing all sorts of assurances to people. And, all of those combined have allowed that system to generate quite a lot of units. And the final thing I'll say is that we started it from a sort of system of units attached to the healthcare department, meaning some of the large hospitals and other clinics. But as we did that and started working with our criminal justice partners, we adapted it to this program called ODR, the Office of Diversion and Reentry, and used the same principles with our criminal justice partners as we had sort of honed and refined with our healthcare partners. So just to put out there that these principles can be used with any sort of so-called target population. It's the same, by and large, the same thing that's involved, making sure that there's good case management attached to people and that there's good real estate-oriented sort of housing search and management. So that allowed Los Angeles to grow quite a large diversion and housing network attached to criminal justice partners in Los Angeles. And I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
And I think next we have Lahela. Lahela, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. This is a new platform for me, so trying to figure it out. Yeah, so I'm Lahela Maddox. I am the Chief Operations Officer for the Regional Task Force on Homelessness in San Diego, and we are the continuum of care for the San Diego city and county. But some of you actually know me from my previous work before coming to San Diego. Actually, I still live in Sacramento working remotely. But I used to work for the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council. And so I have worked with every continuum of care in the state of California and most of the counties and cities, and have worked with actually all of the counties that are on this academy. Additionally in my background is I used to be a direct service provider. I also used to work for a small county for their adult system of care, and I used to oversee all of their housing, both transitional and permanent, for folks coming out of hospitalization. And then I also used to license the psychiatric facilities and mental health rehabilitation centers and social rehabs for the state of California. So also have been to many of your counties and to the facilities that are in your counties. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. And so I wanted to kind of talk about, and I just say, thank you all for participating. I did listen into one of the listening sessions and kind of share some information, and just listening to all of the report outs and some of the, the common themes. And so I just wanted to kind of talk at a higher level, not specifically how the COC functions in San Diego, though I can a little bit, only because some of you may know this, or all of you, but every continuum of care is different. There are 44 of them in the state of California, and everyone looks different. While we have the same, basic mandates and responsibilities, like, the point in time count, the coordinated entry system, the homeless management information system, and bringing down the federal funds for homelessness, how that gets implemented varies widely. Many COCs sit within the county. We have a few that sit within cities, and then there's about 5 or 6 that are nonprofits or joint powers authority. And so we are a nonprofit designated as the lead entity for the continuum of care for San Diego. And so, so I think I just wanted to level set that, because it can be difficult when folks say, connect to your COC. And so while you certainly should, and in the session that I joined, it's important to connect to the COC, because that is where the local priorities are set that someone was referring to earlier about, kind of who gets served or who's in the coordinated entry system. And I'll see that the COC sometimes is one person, but it's really a stakeholder, and it's the community that determines what that priority is. Like for San Diego, our community, through the community standards that are required as a continuum of care, the local priority are literally homeless. And so our community determined, years ago, and not that those can't be changed, but determined years ago that our priority in San Diego would be literally homeless. So when folks are then incarcerated, they lose their, and after they lose their homelessness status. And so while they can be in HMIS and they can be in the coordinated entry system, they won't come up on what's called the community queue, which is kind of the prioritization list that then connects someone or matches someone to a housing resource. And so because of that's the priority set in our community, then that's kind of where the gap exists. And I heard somebody talking about that earlier, that I think that was Casey, that your community is starting to look at what those priorities are. So I just share that because that's the table that you want to be at with your continuum of care and in this planning activity, so that you can help shape what that standard is and what your local priorities are. Because if you don't, then again, that's how that connection doesn't happen. And again, that can be revisited. Those local priorities can be reestablished through your continuum of cares process. So I'll kind of just leave that part, because it is quite complex about HMIS and coordinated entries. I don't necessarily want to get into the details, but just highlight, the importance of connecting with your continuum of care and knowing who that is. And then the other piece of that is, because oftentimes they have the housing dollars related to homelessness, then they are a great resource and a great partner around housing and how to utilize housing within your community and how to utilize the funding, like Charlie was just talking about. There's kind of new funding and new vouchers that come out. At this time we have more funding with a lot of flexibility, more than we ever have had before, for those of us that have been doing this for a really long time, and probably will not have, again at this level in the future. And so really, now is the time to act and to kind of figure out how you leverage that funding. But I think, from working with a lot of counties and continuums of care, and even our own, is that oftentimes there's a challenge in understanding how to utilize the housing eligible uses of the funding that you receive. And so oftentimes we then become what we call service rich, because it's, for lack of a better word, easier to put our dollars towards supportive services, because it is harder to use the housing dollars, not only because of limited capacity, but just in understanding how to use those dollars together, and to really partner them so that you can, maximize their effectiveness. And then also really, like, who has the dollars? Who within your county have those housing dollars that you could leverage with the dollars that your department is receiving? So that's just kind of a few things to keep in mind. And then I want to just kind of mention, and I don't know how much time I have, so sorry, I wasn't watching either. So if you just want to flag me at any point, because I can go on and on. But I did want to kind of build off of Mark's comments about, about housing, and really the importance of streamlining housing and centralizing that. We in San Diego also have a flexible housing pool. We did contract with Brilliant Corners as well. And ours looks a little bit different than LA. They also work in San Francisco and a couple other communities. But to Mark's point earlier, it's really some of the principles that you could implement, fairly quickly without having, right, because you're a smaller county, you may not be able to bring in, someone like Brilliant Corners but you could certainly, implement these things within your county. And again, one of the folks in the report out earlier talked about it, right, is the centralized communication, or the centralized person. And that's really the premise of the flexible housing pool, is that, and I'll say this because I used to be a direct service provider, and I used to be the housing navigator before it was called that, and I used to do kind of flexible housing pool before it was called that. But it's one of those things that, we ask our social workers and our case managers to be all and do all, right? We're asking them to be a support to folks to help them maintain, sustain their behavioral health. Yet we're also asking them to be, liaisons between landlords, and really also be experts in real estate. And so when you mix those two, right, there's a difference between tenancy support and supportive services. And when we mix those two, it can become even more challenging, not only for our case managers and our staff, but also for the person who is housed, who's receiving services. Because here I have someone who's in my house that's, there to check on my, my medication, my mental health, but then they're also like, oh, I'm going to go talk to your landlord and make sure you paid your rent, or, things like that. And so what we have found with the flexible housing pool is that it kind of separates those roles and responsibilities, and really allows the entity, Brilliant Corners, to focus on real estate, securing units, and maintaining those units, and then maintaining the relationship with the landlord. And then we partner with our providers to then be that supportive service and really be able to focus on that and be really good at it. And so, that, again, those are things that, that you could implement at a certain position that you can create, within your structure at your county that can then do that and really focus on that, so then you're getting both needs met most successfully. And I think, those are things like, trying to understand landlord motivation and what incentives. I mean, basically, a landlord is motivated by rent, no vacancies in their unit, damage mitigation, and then ultimately support. What we have found is that, landlords do want to be helpful. People do want to be supportive of the population that we work with, but oftentimes that's connected with either fear or bad experiences or uncertainty that who are they going to call? How are they going to get that support? Who's going to help them, in the middle of the night or when the rent doesn't get paid? And so having a clear person to then be able to contact. I mean, I think, again, when we talk about lessons learned or principles that you can implement in your county or in your programs and embed them in the program that you're designing, even if you can't have, a standalone flexible housing pool, you could implement those concepts and those principles into the program that you design. And be able to fund that. I think that's the other piece with the funding that we have available, is that it also is extremely flexible. There are a lot of things that you can do with some of these funding sources that you couldn't do before, that wasn't allowed, right? These incentives and these landlord mitigation funds and things like that, they didn't exist before. It wasn't something that you could fund. One of the things for our flexible housing pool is that our flexible housing pool does not come with rental subsidies. We don't have the funds for that. We funded the flexible housing pool with our homeless emergency aid program dollars, and then and we did receive some funding from our county. And right now we'll continue the program with our HATS funding while we look for other partnerships to contribute to that, because we do believe that it's a model that partners really well in our community with the rest of our providers. And so, you could, again, implement some of those things within your own county, those principles. And then I'll just say, leveraging the resources. I heard kind of, throughout this session about, how do you partner? What does the communication look like? And I think sometimes, and I used to do this when I worked for the state, when I would go around to the communities, it really is the conversation and education piece that has to happen. And there can't be any shame in that, though I know it's hard, but there can't be any shame in saying like, well, I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is in my community. And you have to start there. If you don't know who the continuum of care is, or you don't know who your housing specialists are in your community that support the housing or do the funding, we've got to be able to ask those questions and come to the table together and make sure that we have the right folks at the table to have these conversations. Because if you don't, you can plan something, but then how are you going to implement and execute that? And so it's really important that you take a look at who's at your table when you're planning those things. Do I have more time, or is that good? Sorry, my poor time management. I did not look at the clock when I started. I can pass it over to Leticia, and then we can always come back if there's questions or.
Oh, hello, everyone. Or for me as well.
Oh, there you are. I can hear you now, I think. Oh, nope, it's not working. Hold on one second, Leticia. I'm going to change your role to a. Okay, you should be unmuted now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, it was great to listen to Lahila and Mark. Hopefully, I'm not too repetitive in my talking points, but my name is Leticia Hinojosa. I work with the Kings Tulare Homeless Alliance. I'm the Coordinated Entry Manager. We are the COC for the Kings and Tulare County, and I've been working with KTHA for about 7 years. Been the CES manager for going on 4 years, and really sounds like you guys have heard a lot about creative entry and some of the ways that the COC functions, and Lahela's right, every COC functions very differently. We're a small COC. I had to count on my fingers. I think we're about 8. When I first started, it was just myself and the director, and now we've grown to 8. We have 2 housing navigators, housing specialist, landlord mitigation specialist, a program manager, of course, our executive director, and our bookkeeper. And so we're slowly growing. And really what, for CES, it's really overlooking the referrals for folks who are literally homeless, staying in shelters, to make sure that the right folks are getting referred, those who are prioritized to these PSH, rapid rehousing, or these EHV vouchers. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few projects that we have in both the bi-county region. We do have a flexible housing pool as well. I'm sure it's similar to how some of the other housing pools function. We actually first started when we got the mainstream vouchers, which are the Section 8 vouchers for folks who are 18 to 61 and have a disability. Those go through CES. And we realized when we got these vouchers, folks needed a lot more assistance than, you know, right, they have a voucher, but they didn't have the funds for a security deposit. Some people had arrears. They just weren't getting into housing with the voucher. And so we were able to partner with Anthem and LaSAR to provide up to $2,500 in funds to families who were able to get matched with MVP, with an MVP voucher. And so we were able to provide with Anthem and LaSAR funding security deposits, utility deposits, past arrearages, application fees, unit holding fees, which we have had to use to make sure that the landlords are willing to continue to work with us. So we'll pay that first month's rent to hold the unit. Rental arrears, so if a family still owes housing authority or they owe a past landlord and that's holding them up, we can pay that arrear. And we've paid up to $1,000 because we want to get this person or this family housed. We're also able to pay for furnishing, kitchen items, washers and dryers. We've connected with a local person who has his own workshop at his house, and we purchase the washers and dryers. It's great. Once we started the program, we started to reach out to community members to see what was out there, and we found this person. We also were able to connect with Mattress Firm to get a small percentage off of the beds that we got for the specific program. So it's been interesting to see how we can really reach out to community members to see what we can, how they can assist these families. So we've actually have 26 families through the Anthem and LaSAR funds, and we continue to work with clients through this project. Those who are non-Anthem, we've added the State of California Emergency Solutions and Housing Fund to assist with similar items like security deposits, utility assistance, arrears. But with these funds, we cannot use it for furniture or kitchen items. So we're they're flexible in that we can use it for deposits and application fees and unit holding fees, but that's it. So sometimes we have to reach out to other agencies to see if we can assist with furnishers, just because we want to make sure that families feel comfortable when they move into their unit and they're not moving into this empty apartment. So we've assisted over 20 families. We have a total of 93 of these vouchers in Tulare County. Another project that we started during this time when we got the MVPs was navigation centers in the major cities to really help clients come in to a one-stop shop to bring in their documents, connect with a housing navigator, and also get other services. So Tulare County does provide services there. We have SSI advocacy. That's really important, especially for the MVP project, and eligibility workers. One of the challenges was the pandemic, so we had to actually stop having these navigation centers, but recently, about maybe 6-7 months ago, we started a navigation center in the city of Porterville, and so we started up again connecting clients to these vouchers, and then just kind of adding to that, we recently received in Tulare County some emergency housing vouchers, actually a total of 117, and then 25 in Kings County. Those are going through coordinated entry as well, and so Navigation Center is a great spot to get folks those services, housing assistance, to connect them to these vouchers. And so I imagine you may have heard about the EHVs in this training. They do have, or they're connected with 3,500 of service fees. So each voucher has $3,500 through the Housing Authority. You can assist the client with security deposits, holding fees, moving expenses, furniture, landlord incentives. We've been able to pair these EHVs with rapid rehousing because we realized, again, we saw some challenges once we provided the voucher that folks also are in need of case management. So we can pair it with rapid rehousing case managers, rapid rehousing projects, and that has really helped folks get document ready, look for housing, because it's hard to do it on your own. And we've also participated. We started a 100-day challenge when we heard about these vouchers because it's 117 in Tulare County, and we really wanted to bring service providers together to collaborate and see how many clients we can get document ready within 100 days. And so we started this unreasonable goal to really foster collaboration between agencies, locate gaps within the system to better serve our population. So we've met weekly, every 2 weeks. We're actually on day, I think, about 84. And although we knew we weren't going to meet our goal of housing 100 people in 100 days, we really wanted to stretch our resources to assist as many as we could. And we currently have been able to house 13 folks. It's a mix of EHV and MVP, continuing to use the flex housing pool that we have as well for those who need it. And we have a landlord relations specialist who's been working with landlords to connect them to any resources and talk about the projects that we're doing. And we've also partnered with a local developer. And if you're from Tulare County, you may know, I'm sure you know them, the so Self-Help Enterprises, and they build affordable rental apartments. And so they've actually set aside 12 units during this 100-day challenge for our clients, our MVP and EHV clients. So we've moved in 12 families. And we've received a lot of partnership with other agencies. A faith-based community partner is assisting folks while they're moving into their units. So it's been a big partnership to really have this 100-day challenge and have all these vouchers, and then also just continuing to use this flexible housing pool. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is during this also 100-day challenge, I was connected with the local Tulare County Sheriff's Department, and it's called the Residential Substance Abuse Program. So I'm still learning about this project, but we've been able to have meetings and learn about each other's projects and the system so that we can assist folks who are in the program and are exiting jail. And so we've talked about EHV, we talked about MVP and how to get folks into coordinated entry. because as others have said, it's challenging to get folks who are incarcerated into coordinated entry. They lose their status after 90 days of homelessness if they enter jail as homeless. And but we've found during our communications that some folks may not lose their status because they're not there for 90 days, kind of know who's going in homeless and who's already in HMIS. It's challenging because folks get lost in the system, but we've been able to communicate, and we have referred a few clients and connected at least one to Bridge Housing, which is a project that helps folks for about 90 days to really work on housing, all their documents. And the pathway is there and it's open. And so I really am excited to continue working with this project to connect folks who are exiting jail and going into homelessness to see if we can provide that pathway into Bridge Housing or even the project Room Keys. But really, without that communication, we wouldn't have been able to, do that. And so we're still connecting, emailing. When they have a client that is ready to get exited, they let us know, and the CES team, we put our heads together to figure out, okay, what's the next move for this person? Is there a bed available in Bridge Housing? And so lessons learned, I would say through these projects, it's important to involve folks who have lived experience, to listen to common barriers to housing and to understand how to use. So that helps us understand how to utilize these flex funds. I think in the beginning, we really didn't know what was a necessity until we started listening to folks and what they needed. Of course, case management is important. And then just also knowing that some families do have a different need for flex funds. And so we may say that it's up to $2,500, but we want to make sure that if they need a little bit more because they're a bigger family, then we want to be able to assist them and have that flexibility in our funds. So I think that's it. And my last thing is a plan for internal processes of application and approval, payments, logistics, documentation, HMIS. It's a challenge to get all these documents in to cut these checks, but we try to work quickly so that we can have these deposits for these landlords so that they don't lose interest and we can house our clients as quickly as possible.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you all so much for sharing. That was really wonderful and useful. We have a little bit of additional time for people to pose some questions. I would recommend maybe that you start putting those in the chat, and either myself or Ashley can read them out to the panelists. But while people are thinking about that, I will pose the first question just to get things started. I would say, and really anybody could take this, what would you say, for the communities here who may be expanding their initiatives around housing or just getting started on new housing plans, what are some of the first key steps that county teams here could take to sort of pull together the resources locally to sort of pool resources for rental assistance and services and other costs? Like, the housing system can be pretty overwhelming. Where would you suggest people start?
I think I would start with, well, a couple. One is I would start with your COC. I mean, I know that in a couple of the sessions and folks, it was new to them, or not a connection had been made yet with the continuum of care, just because, as you said, like the housing and the funding can be pretty overwhelming. And I think it's also just not always knowing who has the money and where it sits, even internally, right? Like there's money that sits in different departments within the county. And so kind of knowing who the players are, I think is a good place to start. And then I think I wanted to add on to what Leticia was talking about, is that when you're doing your planning, anywhere you can reduce barriers and streamline, like paperwork and kind of what is really required and what's required and what's your wish list, I think is the other thing when you're kind of building a program, is that oftentimes we make assumptions about what we can or can't do. It's like playing telephone, but we don't actually know that that's the truth sometimes. And so a lot of times you can reduce some of that because we've created those systems internally. We've established whatever the process is for whatever reasons they were established and grandfathered in. So I think that would be a place to start too, is just to kind of figure out who are your players and your resources. And then when you look at your barriers, really map them out and be like, what can we get rid of? Like, what can we reduce and what can we get rid of are some places to start, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. The barriers issue, I think, is really key. It really resonates with me that we've created these monsters of a system that are so hard to get people through and house that we have to figure out how to undo them. I would also say that it can be kind of an odyssey sometimes figuring out your local housing system, and so there has to be a balance between trying to learn all about that and convince a lot of players that the target population that we're working with here should take precedent or equally compete or in some way be wedged in to all the other competing priorities. And, so it has to be I would say strike a balance between doing that, because that sometimes can be fruitful and sometimes cannot be. And therefore, take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and do what you know will work and use these new resources. And yes, of course, anyone who has resources that will dovetail with it, take advantage of it, but don't sort of use the complexity of the existing system, which in many places is very difficult to access, to be an excuse not to house people. And that's essentially what we had to do in LA as we got started, was turn away from all of that complexity and all the HUD rules and all of everything else that just kind of stop you at the door. And there really are significant resources here to use. And so don't be intimidated by it, even if you don't think you're a housing player, so to speak. You know what your clients need. You've been working with these folks, and you have people who work with with justice-involved folks. And sometimes you just have to go out and get it for yourself.
And I'll just add, if I can add quickly, just the education piece, because I think it kind of goes both ways. Is that we just got done in San Diego doing an education series between our justice and homeless service sectors, and really it was like basics. It was like, what is the lingo that's used? Because sometimes when there's an assumption that one knows the other and how to best serve. And like you just said, Mark, like you all know the population that you're trying to serve. And who they are and what their needs are, and then how do we match that with the housing resources? And so I think if there's an over-assumption sometimes that one understands the other.
And I do want to add, it is important to connect with your local COC, because otherwise it's hard to know what is happening within the COC. And we try to post on social media, and we have our website, but it's hard if you're not in it. And connecting and going to those membership meetings can be helpful, because that's where a lot of the discussion happens and a lot of the voting happens. especially now with the NOFAs happening, and updates. Sometimes there are updates regarding flex pools or other small projects that are new, like these EHVs. So definitely connecting with the COC is an important piece, and opening that communication.
Great, thank you all for that insight. Again, if you have any questions for our panel, make sure to stick those in the chat. I am going to pose at least one more here. And this, I'd like to start with Mark, but if anybody could chime in here. You know, I made a few, you know, general suggestions in the presentation earlier, but as communities are starting to think about how to use these DSH funds for the most impact, and particularly, you know, for the most near-term impact, because, you know, there are definitely immediate needs here. What would you suggest are the key things that teams need to be thinking about as they decide how to use these funds most strategically for housing?
I would tend to think of them more as focusing it on the rent subsidy part, because I would bet, and I think it's been alluded to, while it's not a walk in the park on the support service side, but you have more support services. And you know, what I found in a lot of communities, they're like, look, we know we have the clients, we know what they need. We can't subsidize their rent. We can't get them into a place because we don't have the money. And so I would look at using this as that bridge. Now, there'll be those who say, well, it's not permanent money, so you can't get started with it because you don't know where it's going to come, where the long-term subsidy is going to come from. But I am one, and not everyone shares this feeling, that you can't, life is uncertain, and funding streams are uncertain. HUD funding streams are uncertain. There's no guarantee. But more times than not, once you get somebody into housing and stabilized, you can put the picture together, the longer term picture together. So I wouldn't use the fact that, you don't have 15 years worth of a guarantee and subsidy to limit your ability to use these funds to subsidize people's rent. And be creative. If it's master leasing a group of 5 rooms in a motel, that you and the service provider have sole control over who is coming and going, because therefore you won't have the stigma and other people telling you can't house this person here for this and that reason. If it's a block of rooms here, if it's a single unit over there, if it's an affordable housing provider that has, a sympathy towards what we're trying to do here, hey, can you carve out 5 rooms for us here? And we're going to provide this extra level of rent subsidy and lock solid services from this group. So I would, just try to dive in and start getting some people housed. And I would use that money, from my way of thinking, it's a fairly rich source of money. The $142,000, if you use it for one person for all of 2 years, that's $6,000 a year. I mean, a month, sorry, for the 2 years. You won't often be using it for that long, so it could be more. But that can subsidize pretty much any environment, and probably also purchase some additional support services. So that's how I would be thinking about it in most cases.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else have thoughts on this question?
No, that was a great response, Mark. I'll ditto everything that he said. I think, you just have to move sometimes and figure out a range of options, right? I think sometimes we get stuck in the planning of like one big thing, or I think somebody said it earlier too, like one big provider. And while it can sometimes be easier to have one, right, that you're trying to work with, we definitely can't count out some of those other smaller, smaller providers and to utilize those resources and build those relationships. I think, we do have to spend the time to build those relationships and partnerships. And I know that sometimes it can be hard for us to do that because we think, wow, we're wasting time or money when we do that. But to house this population in particular, we have to be willing to do that and kind of think outside the box and how do we incentivize, landlords or board and cares or whatever the range is needed. So yeah, I'll just echo with Mark. I'm one of those, like, try it and go and, just try to reduce the barriers and really understand, what you can and can't do. Because oftentimes we can do way more than we think. And I think, and I'll just put in a plug for HUD, because sometimes HUD gets the bad rap of, like, they've made all of these rules. But again, in my experience, I've worked with HUD for a really long time. I like I said, I worked for a county and oversaw HUD funding and actually got called into the headquarters once because we were actually not administering our funds correctly for several years. And I'm guilty of one of those, like, well, I was just doing it because that's how I was trained. But it was not punitive. Like, they're not trying to take the money back because we were doing it with good cause, right? Like, our intentions were good. We just kind of misread one of the components of the regulations of the funding. But they were really helpful in resolving what it is. I think I just share that because sometimes fear comes into place and we're afraid that we might do something wrong. And so I would just encourage you to build those relationships and be willing to, and hopefully you have some good political will and political coverage, and your COC can help with that oftentimes too. It's use the money, do not return it. Do not return that money.
Yeah, I agree with what you both said. We typically try to work quickly when we get funds. It's almost like we're in a crisis mode. Our past director was just really big on that, and it is a bit scary, but we want to make sure that we are using the funds as fast as possible and try to understand the funding stream that we're using. But usually it's been like with these flex housing pool funds, working on those landlords, trying to incentivize them, letting them know how much funds we can pay with a bonus fee or a holding fee to keep them interested and incentivize them, and also talk about if you're providing those wraparound services, because a lot of times the landlords do like that. You want to know that there is a case manager who's going to be working with the client, getting them connected to community support systems. And so just really talking to those landlords, that's one of the approaches that we took when we started this Flexible is just going out, boots on the ground, calling landlords, meeting with landlords. It's been a challenge. It has not been easy, but we've been able to house clients, and it's hard, but you want to keep going and keep trying and use those funds to help these folks. And at the end of the day, it's a great thing when you house that one family with the voucher.
There's just on that same line, sorry, one more thing I would add is, from the county perspective for you all, a lot of times this work is delegated to nonprofit partners, which of course can be excellent, but also I would say don't shy away from using your own connections, your own standing in the community, your own political standing with your directors and your board of supervisors and other business leaders to help identify those units. We did a lot of that. Well, we had Brilliant Corners. I was one of those people who was out there, sort of vouching on behalf of the county, but this is legit. This is real. We're not going to leave you in the lurch. This is a population that we all need to help, and that by turning by closing the door on these folks, that's not a solution. It only causes more problems and more expense down the road. And just really helping from the government side make the pitch for it. Sure, you may use a nonprofit to provide the services and so forth, but also there can be some real leadership on the government side, on the local government side, to induce folks to work with you.
Great. Well, thanks again to our panel for sharing all these great lessons from the depths of your experience in the trenches with this stuff. Actually, I'm going to recommend that we go into break a little bit early. That way it'll give us a little more time for our next breakout session.
Sure. It does look like we might have a question from Betsy Coe. So I'm going to unmute Betsy and see if maybe that was just something that went, a button that she accidentally hit, but let's see. Betsy, did you have a question for us? Maybe not. Okay.
Well, it looks like there is one. I'm seeing one come over my internal chat. I'm not sure who this is from, but someone said, does anyone have any ideas for rural communities? Our housing opportunities are extremely limited. I understand that other rural counties are experiencing the same issues and wonder how they have addressed this issue. Might start with Leticia on that one.
That is a hard one. We just, like I said, we've been calling landlords using Craigslist, using online just Google searches on what units are available. We have our landlord relations specialist who goes out as well and talks to landlords. We have been really fortunate to have a partnership with Self-Help Enterprises, who's located in Tulare County, one of their offices. And they have been a partner of the COC for many years before I started. And so they're a local developer, and they build affordable rental apartments, and they set aside in their grant, I think a minimum of 6 in this last project that they completed about a month ago. And because again, they're a partner, and so we of course asked for more. So they were able to add 6 more. So we really, they set aside 12 units for folks going through recording entry with the MBT and EHV vouchers. So we've just built these partners within the COC. It's really helped outside of the local developer. It's been a challenge, and both in the Kings and Tulare County, we have case managers and the landlord relations specialists going out and talking to landlords, and we've held about 2 units with these flexible funds, but they were over income, and so the clients were a little afraid of taking them, and so we did hold them for a month, and no one took them. But we're continuing to try this different approach to hold a unit with the funds that we have, to see if an agency can assist through rapid rehousing. But it's really just going out, and it is challenging. And I did hear in Kings County that they will be housing a few clients with different projects, rapid rehousing and EHV. But it's a struggle, and it's something that they do on a daily basis. So going out, case managers, and sometimes with their clients to talk to landlords online. Housing Authority has a list of units in Tulare County that are affordable as well, and so they're on the wait list for those units. And also just another thing is also getting your clients on those wait lists for these low income housing, because when there's a unit available, they just go down that list. And we've had success with clients who've been on wait lists. I hope that helps.
I would say that it's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll offer just a couple of things in your different communities, just a couple things to think about. One is, so I worked for a small county before too when MHSA funds came out, and so it was going to be really hard for us to, build something or do a development. So one of the things we did was we purchased one of the homes that we were renting in partnership with NAMI. So NAMI used to hold the leases for the county, but then we did all of the placement and, supportive services and whatever. But we purchased one of the homes that they had, were renting for a long time, and then we renovated it and converted it into permanent supportive housing. So instead of shared housing, sharing rooms, each had their own individual room. We kind of, spiced it up a bit. So that's one option that you could think about, especially with all of this funding we have. That's available. It's really, really flexible at acquisition and rehab. The other, again, is shared housing. And I know we're talking about IST population and kind of in general, kind of both. I know you all are here for IST, and so, shared housing doesn't necessarily mean, though, two people in a room, right? We think of it as everybody having their own room, but living in a 2-bedroom unit or a 4-bedroom unit or whatever that is. One of the other things that we were going to do was we were going to purchase a piece of property that was actually had mobile homes on it before, so it had the slabs and all of the, the setup and everything, and then we were going to purchase, not tiny homes, but they were like small mobile homes, that could be put on the slab. So that was another one that we were going to do, because again, we couldn't build anything in our small community. We couldn't get an affordable housing developer to come. So I know that is a challenge, is to attract an affordable housing project in your smaller communities. The other is, and again, may not be for the IST folks, but if, for your other folks that you might be trying to house, one is relocation or family reunification. And I don't say that in the sense of like, we want to house everybody out of your county, but sometimes there are people who want to move to a different county or be closer to family, and however they ended up in your county is how they ended up. But some of this funding can also be used for family reunification. So that's something to think about, that I think sometimes we just make an assumption that everybody, and I'm not projecting, but that sometimes we assume everybody wants to stay where they are, and while many do and we want to be able to accommodate that, there are times when folks do actually want to live in another state or another county, and if we can do it right and do it successfully, relocation or family reunification is something. And then the holding of the units, I put it in the chat, but on the flexible housing pool and the funding that we created, is that we pay for the unit, like Leticia was saying. We don't actually put it back into the market, though. We've continued to hold them even if they don't get rented, because ultimately when we run the numbers, it's still cheaper to keep that unit in our portfolio versus letting it go back into the rental market, because sometimes it can take a few people before you find, the right person for that unit. And then I'll just, highlight that too, is that the goal of our flexible housing pool is to secure units for the portfolio. We don't look for a unit for a person at that time. We are looking for a unit for our portfolio for this population. And then we look at, who are the potential folks that would fit in that unit. So I think those are just a few things. Again, like Mark said, if you can utilize any motels that you have, or, do some master leasing, that's where the county nonprofit partnership could happen. We used to do that again with NAMI, is we partnered with them to hold the lease for the master leasing, and then the county just paid for all of it. So I don't know if any of those are helpful.
Well, again, that was very helpful. Thank you both. I think it's time for our break now, so I'll hand it back to Ashley.
Yes, so we've got a 10-minute break until 4 o'clock, and then we will come back and do our next round of breakout. So if you all can please be back here in 10 minutes, we'd really appreciate it. See you soon. Thanks. All right, we're recording.
Great. Do we have everybody back?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Charlie.
Oh, I was just saying, do we have everybody back?
I think so, yes.
All right. I hope that we had some good discussions, even though I know we also had some ongoing technical difficulties. In our last 20, 25 minutes or so, like we did before, would just love to hear just a few minutes from each county team kind of hitting the high points on these questions. Just maybe sharing one key thing that you learned, kind of if you have any initial thoughts about how the DSH funding might be most useful to you in the near term, and any thoughts on kind of, you know, if you got there yet, how you might bridge that funding into a longer term housing strategy. Definitely no right or wrong answers, just would love to hear how these discussions went. So maybe could we start with San Joaquin?
Hello?
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 We can hear you, Judy Ann.
So found the conversation really helpful. I think right now what we're having problems with is really closing the gap in funding that's going to be necessary in order to provide the housing that we want. I know our county district attorney's office has kind of been against the idea of having the clients scattered throughout multiple places or using vouchers or independent living of any sort. So we're really trying to get them together in one or a few locations, and the cost is proving to be quite high. So it was really helpful to sit down and talk about different ways to try to find money to close that gap.
That's great. I mean, not great that the cost is high, but great that it was helpful.
No, it was very helpful. So we've got a few leads to follow up on tomorrow.
Great. Maybe could you give us maybe just like one example?
I think.
What's that follow up piece?
Well, I think one of them is we want to look at the HAP fundings. I know that I think our county did get some money for that. So seeing how we can utilize that and get a chunk of that money. And then I believe one of our representatives will reach out on the continuum of care coordinator and see if we can get some funding through them. So.
That's great, and definitely, you know, the type of thinking that you want to be doing as you start to think about your housing strategy. Anything else, that important that came out that you want to share with the group?
Ellen, do you have anything else you want to add? I think that's it.
All right, maybe we can move on to Stanislaus next.
We actually don't have anyone from Stanislaus here.
Oh, right. Okay. Then we will not do that. How about Nevada County?
Charlie, this is Sheila. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So from Nevada, unfortunately, we didn't have quite the right people for the housing conversation today. So we mainly just kind of talked about what resonated with folks from the session. I heard a little bit about how it was interesting to hear that some counties are utilizing Craigslist and some of the other creative solutions the counties were coming up with to be able to meet the housing needs of the county. So we mainly talked about just kind of what resonated and what was interesting to the folks from Nevada. One of the things that we thought was that was brought up as being interesting is that for some of these creative scattered housing solutions, that in Nevada County, the judges might want to see more monitoring of folks and how there could be difficulties there if the housing are scattered, if it's not just in one location, one geographic location. So we discussed that a little bit. But I'm not sure if anyone from Nevada wants to expand on that or share their thoughts, but that was kind of just a brief summary of what we talked about on the Nevada County team.
Great, thanks, Sheila. If nobody else wants to chime in, why don't we move on to Tuolumne.
Charlie, this is Tracy. So I think the first, and a really important takeaway is that Tuolumne really faces an uphill challenge in terms of a lack of housing resource diversity. So in thinking through what funds to best utilize, which funds are flexible enough for this county to really try and implement creative solutions in order to really meet the IST population needs is going to be pretty essential. And so one of the, I think one of the models that really stood out to some of the folks in Tuolumne was the options of RVs, and taking that scattered site model specifically and utilizing RVs seemed like that might be a feasible option to really start exploring and look into what funding could be utilized both locally and federally to help support that model. So we really were just trying to discuss, what could be feasible, what could actually be used to really try and achieve housing within an area that just does not have a lot of housing resources available, what is going to be a best fit for that population, and how the case management model would have to really support the specific housing that is available to the IST population. So that, that could entail incorporating housing visits within that case management model, since there's not really a whole lot of permanent supportive housing with on-site, housing support available for that population. So really we were just starting to brainstorm some creative solutions for an area that doesn't have a lot of housing available to their population.
Well, that sounds like a great conversation, and really, I think the type of thinking that a lot of us need to be doing, thinking outside the box, because, you gotta work with the inventory that you have. So, I definitely, love to hear that. And, the great thing about this DSH funding is it's flexible and it can be used to connect with all sorts of different types of housing. And definitely a really good point about how case management kind of needs to meet the unique needs of the population and the geography too, because it's really going to vary place by place. Let's see. What about Tulare? How did that conversation go?
Charlie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we actually have a question, and I'll ask the team to raise their hands if they have anything to add, but they asked me to pose the question to the panel. They wanted to hear more about San Diego County's housing for IST diversion. They had some questions around how that was obtained, which partners coordinate that housing, who manages it, things like that. So I was wondering if we could hear a little bit more about that.
I cannot tell if Lahela is still here. I think she probably is.
I'm still here. I'm hanging in. So we don't in San Diego, we do not, our flexible housing pool does not directly serve IST, though Brilliant Corners does have a program, and I was actually sharing in the breakout that in the Words to Deeds session that is this Friday that I'm moderating, Brilliant Corners will be presenting kind of their the flexible housing pool model and principles, and then be talking specifically about some of the housing that they have provided for the IST population specifically. So if you all can join that session, that would be great. If not, I can always connect you all with Tyler Fong, who's one of their directors, afterwards to chat with you about that.
And this is Ashley. This is Tulare County that had this question, I believe. You can also email those questions into me, and I can connect you with, if you would like, with our San Diego diversion program directly, if you still have those questions about how they are procuring housing for their diversion population.
That's great. And, we can also share some information about the Words to Deed conference, because that is really a fantastic learning opportunity, both specifically for this issue and more generally. So I would definitely encourage anybody to attend who's able to make it. And then last but definitely not least, my new friends from Madera County. Would you like to share a little bit about what we talked about?
I just unmuted Sandra. Oop, and I think she muted herself.
Okay. Yeah, so we didn't have our CAPC, our Community Action Partnership of Madera County, on with us, and they have been working, we have been working closely with them in housing and so forth, and currently we have in our Madera Rescue Mission, it's called the Emerson House. It's a program where we're going to be able to use some of the housing there as temporary housing, and we do have already some beds available. Our clients are, going to be between 4 to 6, so it's a very small population for us. We're also going to look into reaching out to our local HUD authority, possibly. That was a good idea. And additionally, being that we are a smaller county and we are well connected to our larger counterparts, which is to the south of us, Fresno County, I really, appreciated when earlier you were mentioning about, was it the Operation Room Key, I believe, and we were able to utilize a lot of that housing. It was temporary, but there was also another program through CDCR that helped with programming and housing, and that was a little bit more longer term. So we do have some options available. We still have to meet and have more discussions in regards to housing, but these are all great ideas, and appreciate all the different counties and what they've mentioned.
Great, thanks so much. I think the program you're talking about is Returning Home Well, but I might be remembering that wrong.
I'm not sure. I remember. There's so many acronyms.
Oh, I hear you. Well, thank you all for great discussions, and I hope this is just the tip of the iceberg to really get you thinking about how you can creatively use this funding to kind of meet immediate needs in a way that's kind of unique to your county, your population, your size, and then also kind of link it to a longer-term housing strategy. It's been a long day, and we're getting towards the end, so I'm going to hand it back to Ashley to wrap us up.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, everybody, for all of the great conversations today. Before we wrap up, I do want to give a big shout out and thank you to our special guest speakers, Mark Trotz, Bahela Maddox, and Leticia Hinosa, who, I'm sorry, I think I just butchered your last name, of course. It was really wonderful having you all here today to share your wealth of knowledge with this group. We are going to actually, I think, just close out a little bit early today, give you all a bit of time back on your calendars, but we do have one more session left. That is next Monday, November 8th, is our final session in this Diversion Academy, and what we are going to be doing is a kind of a half and half day. So the first part of the day we'll be wrapping up materials for this training group focused on ongoing risk management in the community. So what you need to be thinking about in terms of what happens once you have people who are diverted into your program in the community. And then we are also going to have a panel featuring some more of our current county programs who will come to speak with you all about their lessons learned going through this process with Department of State Hospitals. And we're going to devote the second half of the day to that panel discussion and questions. So please come prepared. Think about any questions that you may have for those counties about their experiences, things that you're curious about or would like to know about the experience of planning, the experience of going through implementation, and the experience of kind of running the programs. The panelists, their programs have been up and running for a few years at this point, and some are brand new and just implemented their programs this past spring. So it's kind of a various perspectives and stages there. So if you want to think of questions, that would be great. And then if you can, I will be sending out a copy of the slides, of course, after today's session, so you all have those on hand, and I will resend the registration link for this final day. I know that you've all probably noticed that we are having some various technical difficulties with the breakout sessions in particular, and one way we try to get around that is by pre-setting the breakout sessions before I start the training, and the only way I can do that is if you register to attend before we start the meeting. So that really helps me out in terms of making sure the breakouts are set up correctly, and it helps at least, I don't know, get around some of those technical difficulties that we've been having to a certain extent, not all of them, certainly. So if you can please just make sure that you are registered prior to Monday, that would be really helpful. And I don't know, does anybody else have anything they want to add? All right, well, thank you all so much, and I hope you have an excellent weekend. We will see you next Monday. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.